we will do a land acknowledgement. So we acknowledge that the land on which we gather in Treaty 6 territory is the traditional gathering place for many Indigenous people. We honor and respect the history, languages, ceremonies, and culture of the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who call this territory home. You can take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so very much. I'm so excited for this. This is part 3. I will start off. I'm not actually in Alberta. I'm in the Okanagan. So I just want to acknowledge that I reside, live, work, and play on the unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan peoples, where I honor and respect the teachings of the elders and the elders to come in future. Let's get to this. This is going to be good. We're going to do kind of give you a little overview here of what we're covering. So a little bit of introductions just about for people who haven't seen any of these before, just on who I am and why I'm speaking on these things. I'm going to do a quick review of the 2 previous webinars as well for people who did who weren't there for those, and or even if you were there, it's just going to give that little refresher and see how everything ties in together. And then we'll be jumping into our third part, which will be talking about gesture and how the combination of shutter speed and gesture works together, along with that crafting story. And then a few minutes at the end for some Q&A, for some questions. So I love questions. So please, there's no such thing as a silly question. Just ask away, ask anything. I'm here for you guys. So who am I? My name is Heiko Wolfgang Ryll. I started teaching back in 2000 after I graduated from NAIT, and I got into continuing studies, and I've been teaching ever since, and I've taught at every single major institution and minor institution in Edmonton. And in about 2011, I fell into photography, and it was nothing that I ever had a plan to get into, and I grew that into a successful studio and event business that still is working today. I just actually got back to the Okanagan from covering Taste of Edmonton. That's one of my big projects per year. I do that 11-day festival where we shot 14,000 photographs, and we created some incredible material for next year. In 2020, I moved to the Okanagan, had the opportunity to move here. And in 2021, I started a tour company that combines the exploration of nature and the hills that I get to be luckily and grateful to live in, and combine that with photography. So I take people out, we go and we hike, we learn about nature, and we learn about wildlife, and we also talk about photography and learn about how we can start to apply that in context when we're working out and about. So my philosophy on photography of teaching is broken into 3 areas, and it's just the understanding of light, space, and gesture, and how those tie into the technical, but also into the compositional, and also into the theoretical and artistic levels. So this webinar was like, it starts with light. Everything starts with light, and we need to understand light. If we don't understand what the light is doing, we're never going to get to that point where we can really start to manipulate and control and bring those visions from inside our minds to those photographs that we want. So that was part 1. And the key takeaway from that is that all light is perfect. You may have heard there's been lots of talk out there. People say never take photographs from 11 o'clock in the morning until until 5 o'clock in the evening, because the light is garbage. And it's like, there's no such thing as garbage light. It's how do you interpret that light is what makes it imperfect. And understanding all the different types and the times of day and what the light is actually doing, we will learn how to control it and create photographs that are dynamic, interesting, and that we're proud of. Photographers such as Ralph Gibson is one of the biggest ones who photographs primarily in the middle of the day. Jay Mizell, in the middle of the day, the time when most times books and traditional teachings have told us not to. We should only photograph in the golden hour in the morning, the golden hour in the evening. Yeah, it's beautiful, but what about the rest of the day, right? We want to learn about it. We want to understand what light is. And there's 5 properties of light, because all light, regardless of if it's the light on your cell phone, the light coming from the sun, the light coming from a studio strobe, all have these same properties. There's the quality. There's only 2 qualities of light. There's hard and there's soft. There's the quantity, which is how much light do we have. There's the quality, which is the hard and the soft. There's the direction, where is it coming from? There's the color or the temperature of the light. And then how much contrast do we have? And when we start to understand and see those things, then we'll know how we're able to interpret it properly, to change our camera settings, but also to create the photographs that we want to create. So how the camera sees light is through what's called metering. And by taking a photograph of the exact same scene with different metering settings, we get different types of results that happen to us. Here on the left, we start with what's called zone or matrix metering. In the middle, we have center weighted, and then on the right, we have spot metering. So when we're utilizing these types of metering modes, it's going to give us different types of results, and we can use that to manipulate the scene to create the photograph that we want to create. Now, that tied into, on the first part, was working the subject. And this is a way to just break through the creative process and get yourself into that mode, but also just to start to understand what the light is doing. Most times when we have a subject and we have our camera, we take one photograph and we're like, boom, we stand up, and it's most photographs in the world are taken between, I think it's like 5'2" and 5'10". That's the average height of most people in the world. That's where most photographs are boring. Once we start moving around and changing that, then we start getting a little bit more interest happening. But when we're working the scene, it's about not just taking one photograph, it's about seeing how much we can get around our subject. So here, by getting around into 8 parts, so take it from the front, go 45 degrees, go 90 degrees, if you're possible, just to get all these photographs. Some of them might not be good, right? Some of them might not be what you're looking for. But what's happening while we're doing this act is that we're doing work. And while we're doing work, inspiration starts to occur. That's when the work really starts to get interesting. Now we take that and ramp that up one more step and add another variable into it and change our height. So we go from a bird's eye view to an eye level to a worm's eye view. We incorporate those. So every time we take a picture on each one of those angles and we go bird, human, worm, now what we have is we've got a minimum of 24 photos for every subject that we have. And now we've got the option to, when we go back to post-processing and start to look at our photographs on what's happening. And then we also start to explore and take photographs that we never would have thought we would have taken that are going to open up something very interesting to us. So here's an example of that. The photograph on the left is me just walking down the trail, and I just snap a photograph of the tree that's in front of me on the trail. And go to 90 degrees, photograph that exact same tree. Then go to the back of that tree, turn around and take a photograph. And I've got 3 different photographs of the exact same tree that are telling a different story. Then the story here is that what the light is actually doing. So it's understanding that here, when the light is to my back, this is what I'm getting. When the light is to the side, I'm getting more texture that's starting to happen. When the light is in the back, I'm starting to get more atmosphere. So I'm learning while I'm doing this. And this is a great exercise to do whenever you're out and about in photographing. Just try to just think about working the subject and think about how many directions, how many positions can you get around that subject. You're not always going to be capable of going 360 degrees, but, and then start to think about that, changing your levels as well. And it starts to break through that creative process. Then we got into space. Space tied into specifically getting into aperture and how we use aperture for it. And there's a lot of misunderstanding on what aperture really does. Aperture, the key thing that it does is it lets in, it's the amount of light that gets let in. So the smaller the aperture, or the smaller the number, the bigger the aperture, the more light that's coming into the lens. So we're getting more information that's coming in. The smaller that is, the less light that's coming in. What else that does is that creates a difference in the plane of focus. So the plane of focus is the area that's within acceptably sharp is what the term is. And when we're sitting at like an f4, which is a fairly wide aperture, we don't have a wide plane of focus. We're sitting at f8, we've got a wider plane of focus. Now people always, now we're under the assumption that the wider the aperture, the shallower the depth of field is going to be. That is not the case. Aperture is a component of depth of field. Depth of field comes down to a combination of apertures and distances, and specifically the distance from the camera to the subject and then the subject to the background. And understanding what those do and how we can, and if you can manipulate it, that's where you're going to start to get that depth of field. If you want a great depth of field, or if you want a shallow depth of field, you can create a very shallow depth of field photograph with a kit lens from a camera that's shooting at f5.6, even at f16, by understanding how the distances work from your subject to the background and the camera to your subject. So here's an example, a little picture of a killdeer. I'm photographing down on that killdeer. So if we start to think about, okay, my distance from my camera to the killdeer is, let's just say 3 feet. The distance from the killdeer to the water behind the killdeer in this area here in these rocks is maybe a couple inches. So I'm not getting a very shallow depth of field here. I'm getting a wider depth of field that's shot. And this is shot at about an f6.3. So it's not a super wide aperture by any means. It's just to let in that light. If I start to change what I'm with my distances and my position, get around the killdeer, get a background in the far distance, get low to make it a little bit more interesting. So then the distance from my camera to the killdeer is closer than the killdeer to the background. And you get this same bird, different position, same location, just moving around and working the subject when you're doing it. And then now starting to see how space is being used. So the technical aspect of space is a combination of aperture and distances. And you can explore this by, using your lenses and changing those distances and walking around and seeing what you can do. Because even if you're sitting at like an f2.8, and you're far away from your subject and your subject is very close to the background, the subject and background are going to be both acceptably sharp. You have to start to move that subject around to be able to get this type of feel that you're going to be working with. Now, compositionally with space, we have 4 types of space that we can use. And now we start to get a little bit more creative with our artistic eye and how we're starting to look at the scenes, where we have deep, flat, limited, and ambiguous. So deep space is creating 3 dimensions. A photograph is only a 2-dimensional object. Even on the screen, it's just a 2-dimensional object. We're using technique like converging lines in deep space to create depth, and things like selective focus, atmospheric diffusion, overlap, those sorts of things to create that depth. Flat spaces, we're squaring off to all the planes. We don't have any converging lines within the scene, and we start to bring connection with our subject. So a deep space is going to start to open up more of an establishing shot and starting to tell the story. Flat space is now going to start to build a relationship between our subjects and the other elements within the photograph. Now, limited is the interesting space where we're combining deep space cues with flat space cues, with the exception of converging lines. We're still working with planes, but we're utilizing some of those flat space or those deep space cues to be able to create that feeling of depth, overlap, tone, those sorts of things. And finally, there's the ambiguous space, which is just about creating visual chaos. Lots of detail shots are like this, macro photography is like this as well. It's something that creates a visual tension inside of us, and you can kind of, I like looking at ambiguous photos like this one of this weird stair set, because it gives you a little bit of anxiety. You can kind of feel it inside your gut. You combine this with your technical understanding of what depth of field is doing, and I've got all these options that you can go and start to showcase what your subject matter is. So from those first 2 webinars, these are our takeaways that we had, right? All light is perfect. Aperture controls the amount of light and the acceptable area of focus. Distance is the key factor in depth of field. We have 4 types of space. Wide angle lenses create a greater depth of field than zoom lenses do. And finally, it's about curiosity, being curious and starting to explore technically, but also starting to explore visually and artistically. Now, that brings us to part 3 today, and the last part in gesture. And this now is where it starts to get, this is where it really starts to open up, and we're starting to look beyond what the technical is doing, and we're starting to look into the feelings, and we're starting to look for emotions and stories that are starting to come out of our photographs. This photograph here I always show this at the beginning of every one of when I start a new series of courses, because this is the photograph that made me understand the importance of photography and why I need to take pictures, but why everybody needs to share their pictures. This was a wedding of my cousins from my wife, and we were sitting up at the front, and I was just behind the father and mother of the bride, and they just did this holding hands while they were exchanging vows. And I had my camera there. I wasn't the wedding photographer this time. I was still new. I didn't know what I was doing with my camera. This was right at the start of my photographic journey. And I was like, this is a cool photo. So I picked up my camera, I took a photograph of it. Looking back on this photograph, the gesture that we have here with the mother and father holding hands, the father endearingly holding the hand close to his face while they're watching their daughter move on to her next chapter in her life. It's such a powerful story. And this is a story that, this is a photograph that the wedding photographer couldn't get. The wedding photographer was focused on what was happening up at the front. This was something that somebody in the background who wasn't a photographer, I wouldn't say at the time, but snap this photograph. And this comes back, and I keep looking back at this photo just to remind me of why it's important for us to do this and to share these moments and to capture these moments and to share them with people so they can see them. Then, you know, the story doesn't have a happy ending because just shortly after this, the mother passed away. So this is a very powerful image that conveys this love and this transfer on of generations. So it's powerful. And I hope you have this photo. If you don't have a photo that's similar to this, that means something to you, you will get it. Just keep pressing the shutter button and keep it with you all the time. So you can look back on it when you start thinking that you're not good enough, or you know, why am I doing this? Look at these photos, and they're just like, they just remind you and bring it all back down to that beginner level where things were just so exciting and things were so new. Tied in with gesture, we have that what's called the decisive moment. And this is something that was a term that is credited by a photographer by the name of Henri Cartier-Bresson, a very famous street photographer, no longer with us, unfortunately, but he coined this term because there is in every scene that is in front of us, there is a perfect moment, and it is up to the photographer to anticipate and to know what's going to happen and to snap that photograph. So there are those moments that we have. This is something when you're out and about here, taking a photograph of a small hummingbird, but waiting for that hummingbird to turn its head to a certain position. So now you're starting to compositionally have that line that's coming up, but flowing through where the hummingbird is looking and then out to the right-hand side. But it's that perfect moment of that scene that just like tells that whole story where you're seeing everything, the colors, everything just comes together and you just know it. It's inside of us. It's something that we have, and every single one of us has. You need to go out and you need to keep snapping photos to be able to get these specific moments. Here in the mountains in my backyard was this incredible scene of Giant's Head in the background, but we have wild horses that live in our area and they just roam wild all year round, and having these two horses come into the scene and then having them both turn their head at the same time, that's that decisive moment where this is the perfect time to snap that photograph. And sometimes it's capturing a period of motion. Sometimes it's just capturing a look. Sometimes it's capturing a touch. Sometimes it's capturing a color or the light, whatever it may be. We have those are in front of us, and it's just being able to wait for them and have the patience. When you have a child in front of your camera and the child is being a child and they're being crazy and silly and reckless and running all over the place, and then there's that one moment where there's just this introspective look and you capture that moment, that's just like boom, and there's nothing that beats that feeling. The one thing you can see down here, again, this is like the power of photography. What you leave out of the frame is just as important as what you leave in the frame. Is down below holding like two hands of licorice, and I believe she was looking at the ground because she dropped one, and it's just the emotion and the feeling that this happens, and the way the light hits the face perfectly. It's just a perfect moment. Here, when a dancer in mid-movement is looking up at the light, and it's just capturing that shape and that form of the way that the muscles in the neck with the shoulders, with the musculature of the back and the lats going down into the rib cage, it's just creating this incredible shape that's happening. This was the perfect moment to have that with the look, the intensity of the gaze and everything that's happening with her. And it's just that moment, like snap, this is the perfect time. So it's not about being lucky when you're doing this. It's about waiting and knowing that something is about to happen, and being that master of what's called anticipation, and snapping those specific moments and being there ready. So here, this was a photograph of a kingfisher, and I was on a kayak at this time and had my camera, and these guys are really hard to get photos of around here, and just being able to get close enough to get that photo while the kayak is moving, allowing me technically now to start to incorporate the shutter speed into it, and speeding that shutter speed up to like 1/8,000th of a second to eliminate all the movement that I have going on. There's no way to stabilize. And then waiting for that moment where the bird takes off, and being able to capture, being able to freeze that moment of the bird taking off and flying away is just incredible. And that's that understanding and anticipating what's about to happen and being ready for when that actually occurs. So before I move into the shutter speed portion of this, and this statement here about transcending the superficial, The superficial sums up. It has nothing to do with equipment. Gesture has zero things to do with equipment. It's not about the newest camera body. It's not about the sharpest lens, whatever that is today. And it's not about the newest this or that or this preset. It's about being in the right place at the right time, anticipating that, understanding what it is that you want to get, and then snapping that photograph at the right moment. That is the decisive moment. So the last part of this is the technical aspect, and that's the shutter speed. So shutter speed controls how long this photosensitive sensor is exposed to light. So the slower the shutter speed, the more light that's going to come in, but also the more opportunity for blur to happen. Now, shutter speed is also the key factor in out of focus photographs. So I've had students over the years continually say, like, do I need to buy a new lens because all my photos they always seem a little bit blurry, like a little bit soft. I don't seem to ever get anything in sharp focus. My initial question is, what's your shutter speed set at? Because for the most part, our shutter speeds are too slow to be able to handhold effectively for the type of photograph that we're doing. So kind of a general guideline to help us is if you keep your shutter speed at 1/2 times whatever the focal length of your lens is. So here with my camera here, I have like a 105. So to effectively handhold this, I should be about 1/250th of a second to be able to handhold this effectively and have a little bit of movement if the subject is moving a bit, but to be able to make sure that those photographs come back sharp. As soon as I start to dip beneath that, I'm going to have to start to get into other types of techniques to help me. Number one technique is to make sure you've got stabilization. Tripod's the best option for that. If you don't have that, backpack, something that you can rest your camera on. For some people, a lot of people, if they're right-hand dominant, they're a right eye shooter. For some of us, for some weird reason, we're left eye shooters. So I'm a left eye shooter. So I always look through my camera through my left eye. And that gives you a little bit of an advantage if you're a left eye shooter, because what you can do is you can actually rest your camera on your shoulder and you can get nice and tight into your camera, make a nice tight little package, and be able to handhold your camera at slower shutter speeds. Also, pushing yourself up against a wall, a tree, something to get stable, not having your elbows out, having everything nice and tight, get nice and tight, the tightest little package that you can. And when you're snapping and you're pressing down on the shutter, try not to push the shutter. So when you push it, the camera has a tendency to move and tendency to tilt. You may see this in some of your landscape photos. Sometimes the 90% of the missed horizontal horizon lines is because people are pressing the shutter too hard and they're pressing down. As opposed to pressing down, pull back. And if you pull back on the shutter and just kind of run your finger over top of the shutter, it's still going to snap itself. Go halfway to get it in focus and then keep going. And you can get it, as opposed to pushing down and then you're getting that twist that's going to happen. Now, with shutter speed, a few things we want to be conscious of, and it's just like, what is it that you're photographing? So if it's something that's a fast moving object, boost that shutter speed up as high as you can. Go into shutter priority mode, get that shutter speed up and control it. Let your aperture go, let your ISO, auto ISO, set that up, let it go there, and then allow, so you're controlling the type of how you want that motion to be conveyed. Do you want to freeze it or do you want to incorporate motion for you? And this is where I come in and say, like, shooting in manual all the time is not the holy grail. It doesn't make you a great photographer by any means. It just, shooting in manual is perfect for when you're in a condition where you can lock everything down and you've got the time to control it. When you don't have a lot of time, that's where these semi-automatic modes come into play. Shutter priority, aperture priority, and even program mode come into play because they allow you some flexibility with only having to worry about one variable. Aperture or shutter speed, and then program mode, you're not really worrying about anything. You're just worrying about exposure compensation at that time, making it brighter or darker, but you're able to capture the photograph that you want. So here's that little hummingbird taking off now. And because I had my shutter speed fast enough, I was able to actually freeze the hummingbird's wings, which is a very difficult thing to do. And this is sitting at maximum like 1/8,000th of a second to be able to snap this photo of this little guy. The opposite of that is when we get into emphasizing motion. So here, and I'll take a moment and just for us to just acknowledge the tragedy that just happened in Hawaii and the loss of the town of Lahaina, which is devastating. And this photograph was taken there during one of their pig roasts, and it was just the fire spinner. As opposed to freezing the motion, keeping my shutter speed slower to be able to get that full circle makes it a more interesting photograph for me. It starts to convey a little bit more starts to tell a little more of that story, and that's the gesture that we're looking for inside of our imagery. I'm here with dancers that are warming up. So this is just pre-performance, and the dancers are moving and they're wearing their sweatpants and their socks. You can see the socks on the ground there with the director in front, and just slowing my shutter speed down to just capture the movement and capture the shapes that they're creating. And it's just spectacular. If you ever get an opportunity to do this, to be with dancers and use slow shutter speed, it's spectacular to watch the lines and be able to capture the lines and the shapes that they're able to have. And this just tells a totally unique story. And it's during rehearsals. There's not a lot of great light that's going on. There's not a lot of, they're not looking interesting. They're just wearing their own normal everyday clothes, but we're dealing with that. And then we've got their shapes within it. And the closer you get in, you can start to see there's like little faces and there's little fingers and stuff that start to come up, and it's spectacular. Now, gesture with the mundane. So here, when you're doing event photography and stuff, you're dealing with a lot of things that can necessarily be exciting. But by thinking of differently and going like, it's somebody holding something, the way that the fingers are holding the piece of paper, that's where we're starting to bring that focus into it. And that's the gesture on this specific scene that we have, and dealing with things that aren't necessarily as exciting, but making them interesting. A creek. This is a standard photo that a lot of people would take. And you come up to a creek and you see it and you snap a photograph of it and you're like, oh, okay, well, nothing super exciting. But what happens now if you put your camera on a rock, slow your shutter speed down, allow more of that light and the atmosphere to start to come into play. And now you've taken that exact same scene and you've made it into something that has a different feel to it altogether. The water now becomes this ethereal subject matter. And now you've got this incredible light. You've incorporated some cool colors in the background with the warm colors of the rocks in the foreground. So you're starting to get something that's more dynamic for your image, going from here to here, utilizing shutter speed to control that gesture and to create that gesture that you want. Walking on a trail and it's just grass and rocks, it's not an exciting photograph to take by any means if you're technically perfect. But what happens when you slow your shutter speed down and you create what's called intentional camera movement, sitting at 1/3 or 1/4 of a second and just moving your camera, and you create these strokes and these lines within your camera from the elements that are there, the textures and the grasses in the background, where it feels more like it's a colored pencil drawing in an illustration. And now you're painting with your camera and you're taking something that's not an interesting per se scene, but you're making it interesting and starting to bring somebody in closer to kind of go, what's actually going on here? Like, this is really wild with all these lines and the way they overlap. And it is just like take colored pencils and you just do cross-hatching techniques. Here, a boat on a cloudy day in the middle of our Lake Okanagan here, slowing my shutter speed down, again, doing intentional camera movement to just capture the boat moving in the water, but it just gives a different ethereal feel, more of a ghost feel to it. But with this atmosphere that we had with these low clouds and just the time of day, just created something a little bit more interesting than just a snapshot of a boat that was just moored in the water. Here in the morning, combining that, and the light was incredibly beautiful and the water's moving, but putting my camera on my backpack on the ground and slowing the shutter speed way down to make that water smooth and glassy, and just be able to get these different tones that are coming across and looking off into the distance into Penticton here is what we're looking into, and getting that feeling of the light and the smoothness of the water. It's just interesting. It's like cotton. It reminds me of like cotton candy or something like soft and cushy that you can get yourself into. And then I start to get into into series, and I've had a studio business as well, and done stuff for worked with Revlon and American Crew, and Wella, doing hair and beauty photography, but also working with just that traditional studio work. But how you can start to bring gesture into this as well, and just like looking for the shape of the body, what the person is doing as they're moving, the details, the close-ups, building that trust with your subject to be able to get good and close, to be able to get a shot like this, and putting them together and seeing how they relate to one another is just starting to tell different stories that we have. And we're starting to create that by thinking in multiples as opposed to one-offs. Here, there was incredible light that was coming through, and this was a really hard light scene. So, lots of contrast that was happening with a teacher, a mentor, talking to a student, guiding a student through an exercise, and just having these different types of shots together, with photographing the hand, photographing the introspection, photographing the connection, then photographing the teaching that's occurring, that's going on. And you can see starting to build on these stories. And this is the things that I think it's inside of every one of us that we have. And it's just a matter of just being there, being ready, having our cameras with us, and just exploring and seeing. I worked around the scene here as well, and just kind of moving to get different angles and to see this a little bit differently. Black and white's perfect because it eliminates any color emotion to it, and we're just focused on the feeling. Here's those dancers part two, that earlier shot that we had with the dancers that were just kind of doing the smooth, the warm-ups. This was them getting ready to go on stage, and all these dancers are very young, incredible performers, incredible artists. But I was backstage with them, and just there was this moment where they were joking around at being kids, and then just before they stepped onto stage, they had this moment of snap where they got into their professional mode. And it was just capturing those moments, and the way that the light was coming across and being able to get these edges, just started to tell an incredible story. And I made a huge series of this. This series toured across Alberta, which I'm very proud of. And it's just incredible amount of photos, all taken with a small little X100 camera, nothing major, nothing big, nothing massive. And it was just being in that one place and seeing something going, I'm just going to explore this, not knowing at the time when I was shooting it what it was going to turn out to, going back home and then looking at the photos and going, wow, there's some magic that happened here. Weather is a great one as well to capture for gesture. We've got, there's a chill that comes into play here. And this is a location here where we have a trestle bridge, that's still an active trestle bridge where a train goes across it for a tourist attraction, but just getting this heavy snow and just the atmosphere that I was able to capture. And that's what I was photographing, and putting that together into a series of images by working around that whole scene and seeing the bridge at different angles. It allows us to create that story that's coming from that scene. And that's our three parts. So we've got light, understanding what light does, knowing how the camera reads light, knowing how to manipulate light, space, understanding what aperture is really doing, creating that depth of field, but also using compositional techniques to be able to start to tell different stories inside of our image. And then gesture is looking for those feelings, those small little, it's that icing on top, that little cherry on top that we want to put on our images. And these are the things that draw people in and start to make people interested, and it starts to tell the story for our photos. So here's all of our outcomes that we did in our three workshops. So the two new ones after being curious, which is the key thing, please just get curious. What does that button do on my camera? What happens if I turn my camera upside down and take a photograph? There's no rules here, and that's what makes it so exciting. Gesture is the bridge between you and the viewer. It's that connector. And then we want to master the art of anticipation, being ready and just knowing that something is going to happen. It speaks to us inside. The universe gives us these things. I so believe that. We just need to be ready to accept them and ready to push that button to snap the photo. So to kind of just wrap up, we're actually right on track here. What's next? So what's next is, I don't know where everybody's going to be in a different place in their photographic journey. MacEwan has had this digital photography certificate for a long time. It includes 5 courses. There is a photo basics. So if you're brand new, let's say you just bought your camera and you don't know anything about it, photo basics is a short course that's just kind of gets you up and running with your camera. Photo 1 is where we start to get into the technical aspects of photos to capture properly exposed and composed photograph that start to communicate a subject and a message. So we start to talk about what's called intention and incorporating intention into our photography so we can go and come home with something that we're happy with. Photo 2 gets a little bit deeper into advanced controls and techniques, but it's focusing more on the different subject matter. So it's understanding who our subject is, how to gain access to that subject and get the response that we're looking for from that subject. And we explore many different genres of photography, portraiture, landscape, architectural, still life are the key ones that we focus in that one. Photographic lighting techniques, which used to be called speed lighting, but we changed the name of it because it's more than just a speed light. It's more than just a light that we put on top of our camera. It's about understanding available light, natural light, and artificial light and created light that we can create, and how by understanding and manipulating them all, how we can get incredible results from the worst conditions possible. Photographic post-processing was changed, new name as well, from Lightroom is what it used to be called. We still will use Lightroom in there, but also expose you to there's different tools out in the market. Lightroom is not the be all end all. There's Capture One. There's so many different other ones that are starting to come out now. Photo Mechanic, we're able to utilize that for post-processing techniques. And it's all more about workflow, understanding, from the pre-production to the production to the post-production and the editing of our photos, how we can get that vision inside of our mind all the way through to the end. And it really starts to understand what the capabilities and limitations of our cameras are and how we can start to use post-processing to complement that. And it ends up in right now, and the whole thing sums up in independent projects where we have a series of assignments that we send you out to do, and you come back and you do it, and we talk about it throughout the course. And you guys are once you have that, you then can apply for your certificate of completion. You get your full certificate. So photo 1, here's our key learning outcomes that we have. These are all the things that we target. And this is something I do in all my classes, kind of tie everything into words. And photo 2, here's what we focus on. A key one here is like turning around. Make sure to turn around when you're taking photos. Now, new that's going to be open, that's starting this fall, is there's an advanced photography certificate where we've created a few more programs, a close-up and long exposure photography, so macro and long exposure photography. There's also an astrophotography course. Photoshop for photographers was a course existing, but we now rolled it into this certificate where it's taking what photographic post-processing ends and taking up one notch higher about using some advanced techniques in Photoshop that's specifically to manipulating photographs. Starting your creative business is, if you want to take the route of starting to make money and becoming a professional, we guide you through this workshop to be able to leave. So you've got a plan, an actionable plan, so you can go off and start making an income doing this and taking it to wherever you want to take it to. And then we finish off as well with advanced photography projects. So this one, you can take a combination of courses to apply for the advanced photography certificate that's coming up. So if you want to learn more, MacEwan.ca/photography, or email business@coned@MacEwan.ca, and you can register for these courses that are coming up. We've got a new round that's starting up in September. We're just finishing up independent projects right now from the last crew. We've got a whole new crew that's going to come in. The classes are going to start. I will be the facilitator for the online classes because I'm in the Okanagan. There's instructors, so they're going to be doing some face-to-face classes as well. So we're going to be offering both to just enable options for our learners. Not everybody is capable of taking evenings and paying for parking and all of that stuff to come downtown. So it makes it a little bit easier. Some people are out of town, and this way they don't have to come into town, and they can take these courses. We've had students from all over Canada. We've also had students when they're traveling come from like Arizona and stuff when they're working. So they can still manage to take these courses and